It's Monday, it's 12:15 and we're live in Westminster. Joining me, Conservative Party Vice Chair Andrew Bowie, Labour peer David Blunkett, Labour List editor Sienna Rogers and Spectator assistant editor Isabel Hardman. Today...
I don't think you can cautiously cuddle.
Definitely not cuddling today. Things turn poisonous at the top of Labour.
Labour's got to stop this sort of internal focus, the civil war between those on the left of the party, those on the right of the party.
And is Nicola Sturgeon right when she says this?
The people of Scotland have voted for the SNP on the strength of offering, when the time is right, an independence referendum.
Well, let's start with hugging, cautious or otherwise. Show you a couple of headlines in the Daily Mirror. They have the darling hugs of May. And this is the headline in the Mail, a huge hug for Britain. We are about to get the news later on today, we're expecting it anyway, from the Prime Minister at a press conference that you will be able to hug again. So my question, this is in England and we'll go to Scotland and Wales in terms of the details there in just a moment, but broadly speaking, are you ready to hug again, Andrew?
Well, of course, I didn't know who's asking, Jo, but no, I want to preempt anything that the Prime Minister's going to announce at 5 p.m. today. What we can say is that, of course, for a lot of people across the country, it's been far too long to been able to embrace and hug loved ones and their family. And so this will come as a great relief if indeed it is announced later on today. But as with everything else, the decision that we've taken and will be announced guided by the science and the advice that we receive from the medical and scientific experts.
Right. And David, what about you? If that announcement, as expected, goes ahead, are you ready to hug again?
Well, I must admit on air that outside my own house, I have actually hugged. Last Thursday, we had one bit of joy over the last few days. My wife's oldest daughter had a little girl. Oh. And I gave her a hug with her parents' permission yesterday. I'm double vaccinated. I don't really need the great leader's permission, I think, to cuddle a baby. But who knows, somebody might be knocking at the door any minute now.
Well, it is only a guideline, so I think we can allow that. It's not the law. Congratulations, by the way. Isabel, what about you?
I'm fine with hugging, but I really hope that one casualty of this pandemic will be air kissing. It's the one thing I hate about my job is having to air kiss people because it always goes wrong in some way. You accidentally do a double kiss when they're only going for one, or they try to shake your hand while you're going in for a kiss and you end up having a collision. It would be great if I never had to do that again. Happy to hug.
I can't even see it.
Yes, this is the social contact etiquette here. I like the fact that we're getting into the granular details. Sienna, what about you?
Well, I don't think many people in the Labour Party feel like hugging each other right now. Hugging them, probably. But, yeah, I mean, I'm not too bothered about hugging because I've been fortunate enough to kind of have my partner. I just feel really sorry for all the single people who have been so deprived, you know, swiping right on Tinder, but then they have to go to a park and stay meters away from the person. So I feel very, very sorry for them, mostly.
Yes, and I'm sure others do too. Just to give you some of the details elsewhere across the UK, in Wales, you can already hug your extended agreed household. In Scotland, still no hugging. Probably won't be advised to do so, certainly at the earliest until the end of June. So no hugging there in prospect. But again, this is guidance and the government is still urging people to be cautious when it comes to physical contact with others. The other bit of news related to this is that the COVID alert level is being reduced or has been reduced from 4 to 3. Now, let's turn to the elections. We're just going to show you some graphics giving you some of the results. Looking at the English council seats there, you can see the Conservatives have done extremely well and Labour have done rather badly. Now, this is at a time, of course, when you would expect the governing party actually to have some quite significant losses at this point in the parliamentary cycle and the opposition to be making significant gains. Well, that certainly hasn't happened in those English council seats, translated into the councils that were won and lost by the Conservative, Labour and the Liberal Democrat. But there were some bright spots for Labour. We can show you here the results of the mayoral contests. Labour have 11 of those mayoralties to the Conservatives 2. And in Wales, there was a very strong performance. In fact, I think it matched their best ever performance in the Senedd parliamentary results, with Labour there on 30. Now, there has been some quite big fallout from Sir Keir Starmer's decision, the Labour leader, to then hold a reshuffle on the back of this. It's triggered an outcry, particularly his sacking of the deputy party leader, not from that role, but Angela Rayner's role as the party chair and national campaigns coordinator. We can see pictures of them out campaigning there. Sienna, why didn't the reshuffle go to plan?
I mean, it was poorly managed. I don't think anyone could deny that that was the case. They started off on Saturday, which I think was the main problem with this whole way that this was done, because results were still coming in. I can't, for the life of me, think of why you wouldn't wait until all the results are in, congratulate the people who've actually won Labour seats and Labour mayoralties, and then start your reshuffle and try and do it as quickly and efficiently as possible. That very much didn't happen. And it seemed as if Angela Rayner, when she was sacked on Saturday, was being blamed for these poor election results, even though, as I say, timing was poor, but also I think everyone knows that she was kind of frozen out and really wasn't in charge of those campaigns. So it just seemed a bit baffling to a lot of people who generally support Keir Starmer, because, of course, a lot of the people who nominated him for the leadership also nominated Angela Rayner for the deputy leadership. It is bad political management, basically.
Isabel, what do you think went wrong?
Yeah, I think that, as Sienna says, the timing was very poor. I think also that there seems to be a lack of recognition that embarking on a reshuffle when you don't have very much political capital is very difficult and quite dangerous. And two of Starmer's key things that he wanted to do were to sack Nick Brown as chief whip. He's very long in the tooth chief whip and has repeatedly been sacked and then brought back in by successive Labour leaders, but also to move Angela Rayner from her party election chair role to the shadow cabinet. And I don't think there was a recognition, or at least a sort of emotional intelligence within his camp, that things had been very more than socially distanced between him and Angela Rayner for quite some time, and that she may not have reacted particularly well to this move, and indeed that she may not have been able to keep some of the details of this confidential, because they obviously leaked very quickly on the Saturday night before this alternative role was able to be agreed upon. And so that really overshadowed everything and turned into what everyone in the party, as you say, including Keir Starmer's allies, have admitted is a big communications mess.
Right.
We've ended up
yes,
the Labour leader looking weaker after this reshuffle, which is not what reshuffles are supposed to do. I mean,
the reshuffle itself, David Blunkett, you've written today in the Mail saying that a reshuffle was inevitable, but it hasn't exactly been a radical shake-up of the top team, has it? Except for perhaps the Shadow Chancellor role, which is now Rachel Reeves rather than Annalise Dodds.
No, it undoubtedly hasn't, Jo. My point was that there would be a reshuffle. Now, either it had to be in the summer or it had to be now. And we always get back to these blasted arcane procedures that get us onto Westminster again. But there's a Queen's speech tomorrow, and he either had to do it quickly and put people in place to be able to answer over the five-day debate that will then take place, or leave it and leave people in place to handle that. It's not an excuse for what's happened, but it is simply a fact. And I suspect the people around him said, either you do it now or you don't. I think there's still room for sorting out some of this. I think we could, for instance, with Wes Streeting, reshape his title to family, to aspiration and to child poverty. Child poverty not, by the way, simply being not having enough money. It's much, much bigger than that. I hope he might give a wider role to Lisa Nandy than the Shadow Foreign Secretary. It's a prestigious opposition role, but actually no opposition role has any prestige, does it? The reason we call it shadow is because you're out of the sun and you're not running anything. And if anyone ought to have a hand in determining how we go forward, particularly in relation to the north of England, it's Lisa.
Right. Well, let's welcome former Shadow Cabinet member, Labour MP Richard Bergen. I mean, Richard, Labour did badly, didn't they, in those election results? They lost 8 councils, hundreds of council seats, a by-election in Hartlepool that they should have held on to, and they lost. When an opposition party isn't making the gains they should be, is it that surprising that the person in charge of the elections campaign is moved?
Well, firstly, the election results were very upsetting and very distressing. In terms of Angela's move, I think it was wrong to place sole responsibility and unfair to place sole responsibility on her for these election results. And I'm glad, and it's quite right, that as deputy leader, she's got a good position in the Shadow Cabinet, as one would expect. But the idea that reshuffles and reshuffling rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic is the solution is wrong. We need a change in direction which can take us forward from these very worrying election defeats.
Right, and that change of direction would look like what?
Well, I think the first thing that Keir needs to do is to revisit the 10 pledges he made to Labour members when he stood for election as Labour leader. The second thing he needs to do is to fulfil his promise for party unity. And the third thing he needs to do is take the fight to the Tories, because there has been a feeling over the last year that the leadership has shown a greater zeal for internal party warfare, for taking the fight to left activists, and it has for holding this government to account, who have presided not only over COVID contract corruption, but over one of the highest COVID death rates in the world. And so I would counsel Keir against taking too much guidance from that article that Peter Mandelson wrote in the Financial Times, for example, which seemed very hostile towards the Labour Party itself. We need to find a new way forward. We need to build an electoral coalition that can take us forward.
David?
Well, I'm terribly sorry, Richard. I'm not going to be divisive with you. But of all the people who could be on the programme saying what you just said about party unity, I have to grimace because, you went out of your way to be divisive when you were in Jeremy Corbyn's shadow team. And we ended up with 203, now 202 seats in Parliament. And we are going to have to completely reshape how we address the world of tomorrow. Not the 1970s, not the 80s, 90s, not the Blair era, but tomorrow. And that means all of us rethinking, not reiterating 10 points or going backwards or arguing about what might have been done, but taking the world as it really is. And that's the thrust of both the article I had in the Yorkshire Post on Saturday and the one this morning. That this is a totally different world that we're living in, and some people are arguing from a world that is bygone.
Richard?
Well, I think what David says about left members of Jeremy's Shadow Cabinet being divisive is unfair, but I'm not on here to have a spat with other Labour figures, so I'll move on from that. David's right that we need to move forward. He's right that we shouldn't be looking to the past, but we can learn some things from the past. For example, in 2017, it was the only electoral advance that Labour's had in a general election for many years. So we should at least learn some lessons from that. And what we can't be afford to do is to be losing voters to the Greens, for example, which has happened in Sheffield and Bristol, where the Labour Party's lost overall control of the council. We can't be affording to be losing an area like Durham for the first time in 100 years. And we can't afford to be going backwards in Hartlepool, where we got 53% of the vote in 2017 and 29% of the vote in this by-election. So what we need to do is we need to take the fight to the Tories. We need to learn lessons, for example, from the United States, where the kind of financial stimulus that President Biden is proposing, I think the Labour leadership should be arguing for at least the equivalent of that here in this country.
Well, Joe, I agree with that last point entirely, and I've been as against austerity as Richard over the last 11 years. There was a lesson from 2017. We managed to coalesce the whole of the anti-Tory vote. The Greens virtually disappeared. We hammered the Liberal Democrat vote. In other words, we pulled together the anti-Tory opposition. What we didn't do was win any Tory votes. So we ended up with 4 more seats than we had in 2010. So yes, there are lessons from 2017, but they're not as simple as Richard's just enunciated.
Right, let me just show all of you, our guests and our viewers, this Daily Telegraph headline, which says Labour will keep on losing if it doesn't find answers. It's an article by Khalid Mahmood, a Birmingham Labour MP. Too much of Labour's energy has gone into identity politics and niche culture wars, he writes. He also goes on to say, we are seen as out of touch, a party captured by urban liberals whose most vocal supporters are university graduates with woke politics straight from the world of campus protests. David, do you agree with him?
Well, they're not all woke. I'm not. I'm a graduate. I may be ageing, and that's another issue. We've really seriously got to address why we've lost the support of the over 60s, massively lost the support of the over 60s. Yes, there is a problem with culture wars. The government are able to identify and use that very clearly. I think identity politics should be about identity within community, holding something in common rather than dividing people. And the kind of culture identity politics of gender, of sexual orientation, of race, divides people when we should be uniting them.
Richard?
I think it's a bit of an oversimplification. I think implicit in some of the commentary on this is this idea that somehow this unflattering caricature of working class people is valid, which it isn't. Working class people want to end discrimination and it's in their interest to do so. Working class people want equality and it's in their interest for there to be equality. So we should never take a step back from the fight against discrimination. And at the same time, we need to be putting forward concrete economic policies which do have wide public support, which will lift living standards, massive public support for a £10 an hour plus minimum wage, massive public support for free personal care for the elderly, massive public support for the public ownership of rail and mail, and massive public support for higher taxes on the rich. But we can't see it as a choice between economic policies and anti-discrimination policies. The Labour Party has to be about fighting discrimination and fighting to lift the living standards of everybody, including those who face extra discrimination.
David?
Ironically, the Tories have effectively renationalised the railways anyway.
Right. I mean, what about, though, on the point on culture wars? I mean, Richard, this is a Birmingham Labour MP. I mean, it's a pretty damning comment, isn't it, to say that the party's not only out of touch, but is actually been captured by university graduates with woke politics straight out of university campuses. I mean, is that true?
I don't think it's true. And also, I mean, I haven't read Khalid's article. I just think it's a bit of a simplification. And look, we want working class people to have the opportunity to go to university. That's why we advocate the ending of tuition fees. I know David may take a different view on that, but we need to start uniting people. And I think uniting people in the party, uniting people in the country, I think denouncing people for having gone to university, denouncing, because let's be clear, when people say woke, what they mean is people being against discrimination. We need to be proud to be against discrimination, but we need to communicate that politics in a way that everyone can understand, in a way that brings people on board and doesn't alienate them.
You're shaking your head, David.
They don't mean that. I teach at the University of Sheffield. I'm a professor of politics in practice. The young people I teach aren't woke. They're thoughtful and they believe in equality and anti-discrimination. The people we're talking about are those who carry it to the extremes and start talking about pulling down statues, trashing the memory of Roundtree, all kinds of nonsense that isn't anything to do with the Labour Party, but we get tarred with the same brush. So whilst I don't disagree with quite a lot of what Richard said, apart from the fact that the working class don't see themselves as working class and in need of being patronised anymore, I actually think that there is a really dangerous issue. And Obama said so in the United States at a point before Joe Biden was elected, that there was a real danger that some other people's politics actually interfere with and smear what we're trying to do. And we've got to disavow those things we really think are very, very dangerous and silly, whilst reaching out to those who want, of course, a radical progressive agenda, but they want to know that we're actually going to get in to deliver it.
I think just to come back, if that's okay,
yeah,
Jo,
just briefly. Go on, Richard.
What's actually patronising in relation to working class people is thinking that rather than bread and butter concrete economic policies, that shallow flag waving and having a strategy of photos of eating fish and chips and drinking beer is sufficient. That's not enough. It's an electoral dead end. It's based upon a patronising caricature of the working class. And I say that as someone that's proud to come from and represent a northern working class constituency.
What do you make of that, Sienna, listening to that discussion, particularly the final bit there around culture wars, as David called it initially?
Yeah, I mean, we're constantly having this discussion in the Labour Party. I think, to a large extent, I think we're overthinking things, we're overcomplicating them. The Labour Together 2019 election review, right, that looked at what happened actually in that general election, what happened to kind of fragment this broad coalition of voters that Labour needs to appeal to. It found that the unifying thing was big economic change. That's what Labour has to offer. In terms of whether it gets tied up in these arguments about culture wars and stuff like that, I think what people respect is authenticity. So I think, you know, don't lie about your opinion. I mean, if you pretend to be on the side of people that actually you're not on the side of, I don't think that's going to come across well. I just think a lot of the time we're just trying to, this discussion is revolving around these perceptions of young people as extreme people who aren't real voters, as if often students are treated as if their votes don't count. I mean, obviously there is a problem with young people not going out to vote, but I think we're just completely distorting the discussion here.
All right, well, I just want to draw everyone's attention to a tweet from Angela Rayner, the Deputy Leader, where she says, well done to Mark Drakeford, the First Minister in Wales and Welsh Labour, for an amazing result there. Isabel, is there something going on here? There seems to be a lot of thanking various winning candidates by Labour. Is this because Keir Starmer hasn't?
I think Keir Starmer has struggled to amplify the fact that Labour has done well in some places, largely because he spent the weekend busily having a fight with Angela Rayner. And so I think her tweet is probably quite pointed, not just in terms of showing that in Wales, Labour had a clear message and all the things she was praising in that tweet, but also in pointing out that Keir Starmer could have perhaps used his weekend better rather than having a fight with her. Now, obviously, those around Keir Starmer would say that she was the one who drew out the negotiations by demanding a work title that wouldn't fit on the cover of a book. And that I think most of us are going to have to memorise and spend quite a lot of time memorising because it's so long. But it's fair to say that this has been a wasted weekend for Labour, given they did have some results later on after the Hartlepool result and so on that were much better for them.
Well, one of those better results was Tracy Brabin, who was Labour's candidate. There she is in the orange suit there. She won the West Yorkshire mayoralty. It does mean, though, that there is going to be a by-election in the seat that she's vacated in Batley and Spen. That's not going to be easy for you, is it, Andrew Bowie?
Well, look, we go into every by-election fighting to win, and we will in Batley and Spen, undoubtedly. It's not for me or the Conservative Party to involve ourselves in the internal squabble of the Labour Party.
No, hence I didn't ask you.
If you want, no, quite, but if you put an example of the bad state the Labour Party find themselves in, you've only got to back in the last 20 minutes of this programme. I mean, Labour Party spends such a long time talking about themselves and not talking to or about the issues facing people.
Andrew, I thought you just said you weren't going to step into this because, as you say, it's for the Labour Party to sort out, not you. You'll be concentrating on Batley and Spen. Do you think you can win it?
Well, look, as I say, go into every by-election
will you win
aim
it?
of winning. Well, I mean, it's not too early for me to predict right now whether we will or we won't, but we'll go in there trying our very best. And I just want to bring it back to comments that Richard Bergen just made. He talks about being patronising. Well, patronising is telling the working class country what is in their best interest to think, which is what Richard Bergen just did. Patronising is the sheer arrogance of a Labour councillor weekend telling voters that they let the Labour Party down by not voting for them. While Labour Party engage in this sort of divisive, distracting talk and discussion, we are getting on, delivering on the people's priorities, levelling up and investing communities that have been ignored by Labour MPs for far too long.
Richard, while you're Richard, while you're giving your answer, perhaps you'd also say what will happen to Keir Starmer if you lose the Batley and Spen by-election.
Well, just to come back on that one first, what's patronising is, for example, thinking that a 37p increase to people's benefits is sufficient, but let's leave that there. In relation to your question, Jo, about Keir, obviously, if Labour doesn't win in Batley and Spen, then Keir will have real problems, because if you're losing again, then eventually politics takes its course. But let's work as hard as we can to win. I'm sure that's something that both David, Lord Blunkett and I, we're both passionately committed to getting Labour to win in Batley and Spen. Tracy Brabin's victory in West Yorkshire was fantastic, but we can't take the election in Batley and Spen for granted. And what the leadership needs to do is learn the lessons from the failures of the last week, learn the lessons of the failures from Hartlepool, and think, how do we move forward and get into a position where we can make a concrete policy offer to people in Batley and Spen, which ensures that we win it just as we did back in 2019.
Richard Bergen, thank you very much. We're going to move on to Scotland and the results there. I'm also going to welcome Kirstin Oswald, the Deputy Leader of the SNP in the House of Commons. She's joining us from East Renfrewshire. Here to our viewers are the Scottish Parliament election results. You can see there the Scottish National Party with 64 seats, one short of an outright majority, but with the Greens, you can see there with 8 seats, there is a pro-independence majority in Parliament. So, I mean, Andrew, the SNP said very clearly in this election they wanted another referendum on Scottish independence. They won the election in the sense they got a lot more seats than any other party. The Scottish Greens also want a referendum. They made that clear in their manifesto, and they've got 8 seats. So there is now a mandate for another referendum, isn't there?
No, I disagree. The Scottish National Party started off the Scottish parliamentary election claiming that if they won a majority as the Scottish National Party in the Scottish Parliament, they would have a mandate for another independence referendum. They fell short of that, not least because the Scottish Conservatives equalled our best result in terms of number of MSPs returned and actually had our highest ever number of votes in the era of devolution in Scotland. So, no, I think it's time for us to all talk of a divisive and distracting referendum to one side and work together and focus on rebuilding this country from the crisis that we've faced over the past year, helping people, businesses across these islands recover from what has been a really torrid time as we've been facing coronavirus.
So, Kirstin, according to Andrew, you don't have a mandate for a second independence referendum.
I'm sorry, but that's simply nonsense. That's plainly not the case. The SNP has won this election with a huge landslide. This is our 4th consecutive term of office. It's an amazing and strong mandate for Nicola Sturgeon. And as you point out, there's a larger majority of pro-independence MSPs in the Parliament too. That's before you get on to things like the SNP winning 85% of constituency seats in the election, the highest ever number of votes in a Holyrood election. I think that there is no way really that you can look at this and say that there isn't a significant and overwhelming mandate for the SNP to go forward and deliver what people voted for us to do. That's what democracy is all about. That's what democracy dictates that we should do. And what Nicola Sturgeon said is that we will firstly look to recovery. That's what she said that we were going to do, and that's what she will do to make sure that Scotland has the recovery that Scotland needs after this really challenging time. And we then will look to move forward with an independence referendum. And I think that Andrew would do well to reflect upon the reality of the results, because I don't think there's any reasonable way to stand in the way of that.
Let's have a conversation a little bit between the two of you. I mean, Andrew, do you accept what Kirstin is saying, firstly, about the mandate, that it is very clear? Both of you agree you don't want to do it right now for whatever reason, but on the mandate issue, it's clear.
Well, look, I think talked about the reality of the results. The reality of the results is that more Scots voted for unionist parties in the Scottish parliamentary election, voted for the SNP or the Greens. So on that basis, there is no mandate. And the other thing that's proven by this election, we cannot trust a word that the Scottish National Party or Nicola Sturgeon says. Just days before the parliamentary election took place, Nicola Sturgeon said that the people of Scotland could trust her to vote for the SNP in the knowledge that they would be pushing for a second independence referendum immediately. And yet, hours after the result. That's exactly what Nicola Sturgeon did. Look, we are absolutely clear. We need to put all of this to one side and work together to build this country back from coronavirus, to help the British people, wherever they are on these islands, get over and through what I said has been a very, very torrid time for them, their families, their businesses, everything else. And if we don't do that, then that's gross discourtesy and disservice to people all across the United Kingdom.
Kirsten, I'm going to let you respond just a moment. Can we just, though, explain, Andrew, that that's not how a parliamentary democracy works? I mean, Boris Johnson got less than 50% of the popular vote at the general election in 2019. But that doesn't mean he hasn't got a mandate, does it?
Of course he's got a mandate.
Right, well, so why have the SNP not?
The Scottish National Party themselves said at the beginning of this election period that a mandate for a second independence referendum would be delivered if they achieved a majority. They fell short of that, and as I said, that's not least because of the great campaign that was run by the Scottish Conservatives, equalling our highest ever tally of MSPs returned to Scottish Parliament. Look, let's put this to one side. This is not what we should be talking about right now. We should be talking about how we can save people's jobs, how we can build this country back better, how we can make a better United Kingdom for all of us emerging from the crisis that we have faced. That's what we are focused on, and I really hope it was what the Scottish National Party government in Edinburgh would be focusing on as well.
Right. I mean, it is true, isn't it, Kirsten, that Nicola Sturgeon, the SNP, have made it clear that they want to get the pandemic over with, whenever that is. I'm not sure quite when you see the date for that to be over. But in fact, she's gone straight back to Bute House and is starting to work on the constitutional issue.
In fact, she's gone straight back to Bute House and is dealing with the recovery from COVID.
No, but that's not what she said, actually, in the interview. She said she was going straight back to work on these issues too.
She's in Bute House now, looking at the recovery from COVID, and she's also looking at making sure that we deliver on our manifesto commitments. I think it's really quite extraordinary the way that Andrew is reacting to this. The SNP did win 85% of constituency seats. We won a landslide. There's no other way of looking at it. To suggest that in any way there is not a mandate for us to carry out our manifesto is just simply untrue. That is just simply not something that any logic can be applied to.
All right, but Kirsten, on that date issue, when will the pandemic be over? I mean, June the 21st, how will you judge? How will Nicola Sturgeon make a decision? The pandemic's over, we're straight onto the constitutional issue. We know June the 21st in England, all the main restrictions will go. So it's not long if that's similar in Scotland.
I think that the important thing actually is for us to have this overview in terms of making sure that the crisis is over, which is what we have said that we would do. We had a plan which we carry out to deal with the first 100 days after the election, because it is such a challenging time, as everyone has said. So I think that, that's the right and responsible thing to do. But I think it's also perfectly reasonable that we should seek, when the time is right, when we are through the crisis, to move forward with another element of our manifesto, which is the independence referendum. But obviously, people's safety, people's health is the immediate priority. That's, I think,
I understand that. It is more a question of when. That's something that you and Andrew...
I think it would be difficult to pin down a particular... I think if COVID pandemic has shown us anything, it's shown us that it's probably not a sensible idea to try and put a particular date on anything, actually. So I think that would be much more sensible, and it may not be a good politician's answer, but I think it's an honest and reasonable one to actually look at the realities of the situation, and that's what we'll do.
Andrew, you accept that, not now, but do you also accept that it will and should happen at some point in this Parliament, because the pandemic will be over by then?
It's quite remarkable, isn't it, Joe? I mean, the SNP don't have any hard answers on the issues of independence. They can't even tell us when they actually want to have a referendum, which is what they claimed they were campaigning for. Look, if you look, they talk about when the pandemic is over, when the crisis is past, they will hold this referendum. We had rationing post-World War II for about 6-7 years. So I think we really need to put this to one side, as I keep saying, and just work together. That's what the Prime Minister is going to do. He's reached out to the First Minister, and I hope that myself and Kurt and other politicians elected at whatever level across the United Kingdom will now come together in the best interest of the British people, be they Scottish, Welsh, Northern Irish or English, so we can put our shoes to the wheel and get this country back on track.
Can I just come in there and gently point out to Andrew that it's really not for him or for Boris Johnson or for anyone else to stand in the way of the Scottish people making the democratic decisions that they wish to. The people have had the election. They have a result from the election. We can all see very clearly the mandate that the SNP has. It's not appropriate for him or anyone else to stand in the way of that.
Right.
And I have to point out to him gently that the Scottish Parliament will decide when the referendum will take place, not me, not him, not Boris Johnson. And it isn't really for us, any of us, to stand in the way of that. That's what democracy is all about.
Let me bring in the other guests. David, you'll have heard Gordon Brown, former Prime Minister, Labour Prime Minister, talking about muscular unionism, and in his mind, it won't work. It's got to be about talking to Scottish people and Scottish voters. Do you agree?
Yes, you need the wisdom of Solomon to be able to get through this, because otherwise it's going to be a continuing running sore that's not going to go away. I don't have the wisdom of Solomon. I would simply say, okay, if you really, really want a second referendum, and this is going to be the running sore in Scotland, then let's fix it. Let's fix it for 2027, pandemic out of the way, recovery underway, and a second Holyrood election having taken place not on the issue of independence and Scottish nationalism, but on the bread and butter issues the Scottish people are concerned about. I think that just might take the steam out of it, but don't hold your breath on anybody agreeing with me.
OK, we won't. We'll take your advice. Isabel, on this muscular unionism, obviously that sounds like the government's plan. Is it going to work?
Well, I think it's better if you do have Boris Johnson making more than sort of flying visits to Scotland, for instance. And I think it's better if you have the UK government trying as much as possible to be in contact with the leaders of the devolved administrations. That was a complaint by Mark Drakeford, that he hadn't really had very much contact from Boris Johnson in recent months. And that obviously needs to change, so that if it doesn't appear that the Prime Minister is just getting in touch with Scotland or indeed Wales when he thinks that there's a problem with the union, that actually he's sort of deeply involved and deeply interested in matters over the border as well. I think there is an issue also with just appearing to concede to the nationalists' demands for independence with more devolution, which is, I guess, Gordon Brown's solution. You can end up basically playing into the nationalists' hands rather than coming up with your own way of thinking and your own way of talking. So I think there's a lot that Boris Johnson needs to do and think about over the next few months, so that he's not just appearing panicked about the union, which has definitely been the case over the past year or so.
Right. I mean, Sienna, can you see any situation where Labour and Tories in Scotland work together in terms of making the case for the union?
Well, last time in 2019 general election, when I went campaigning in Glasgow, the first thing someone said to me is, I'm never going to vote Labour again after voting Labour all my life, because they shared a platform together in that original independence campaign. I think those kind of things, that reaction, that response is exactly the kind of thing that Labour will want to avoid in terms of putting off SNP voters. I mean, it has a really difficult task ahead of, and we saw this in the election that just happened. Anas Sarwar is going down incredibly well on the doorstep. He's really popular with voters. Unfortunately, so is Nicola Sturgeon. And a lot of people, are putting the union or independence first. And it's obviously just like Brexit, Labour is being torn from either end. And it's clearly going to have to find a solution to this, because there was a bit of a holding pattern policy in this election of saying, well, coronavirus, it has to be the priority, and the recovery is going to take years, and that needs to be the priority too. But eventually it's going to have to face up to this problem. I don't see working with the Tories outwardly, publicly, as much of a solution to that, because it's fracturing their kind of coalition of voters.
All right. Kirsten Oswald, thank you very much for joining us. We've got to move on, as we don't have that much long left on the programme, but I'm sure we'll speak to you again soon. I'm just going to return to the elections in England. The Daily Mail, let me show you this headline. The Tories are warned not to abandon the South East following election success in the North, amid fears voters will be unhappy if funds are concentrated in other areas. Now, this was Dan Humphreys, the Tory council leader of Worthing. The party only narrowly retained control of the council after gains by Labour. What do you say to him, Andrew?
Well, I mean, I would say that it's not true that we're just focusing on one part of the country. We are a one-nation party for our entire one nation, and we've seen that in the election results. Our best ever result into the devolved Senate in Wales, our great result in Scotland, even our seat returns in 2016, and of course the fantastic results across it. So we are delivering for the entire country, and we are investing in duties length and breadth. The United Kingdom, we've got more to come. A very exciting Queen's speech about to be delivered tomorrow.
This is someone right at the forefront, on the front line of local politics, and they obviously are fearing Labour making more gains.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, we've got to listen to our activists and our elected representatives at the coalface in local politics. Obviously, we take their opinions on board. But, you know, from my perspective, from the perspective I know of the Prime Minister and everybody else in government, we are committed to delivering for every part of our United Kingdom from north to south. And as I said in the Queen's speech tomorrow, we'll be unveiling a very exciting programme of government to do just that in the next few years.
Right. We've got a slight problem with the line, but we can still hear you, Andrew. David, what do you think? Do you think that Labour and the Tories should be worried about Labour making gains in parts of the South East?
No, I don't. I think that the Tories have got nothing to worry about from us at the moment. In 3 years' time, I hope they'll have a great deal to worry about. And that will only take place if people in the north outside the major cities who are with us actually believe that we can win in the south. In other words, they'll believe that it's worth voting Labour and having a Labour MP if that Labour MP is part of a Labour government. We had a Cabinet Minister, George Eustice, on Saturday, pretty well saying, vote Tory, because if you've got a Tory council, Tory MP, Tory government, we'll give you the money. Straight bribery. It's pork barrel politics, as the Americans used to call it. And we've got to get round that by saying we will win. By the way, it's the same in Scotland. People won't vote to stay in the Union and won't vote Labour unless they believe that Labour can win across the United Kingdom.
Right.
So we've got a major challenge. And honestly, we have a historic requirement. It's our duty to ensure that we win.
Right. I mean, Isabel, do you think voters and perhaps council leaders are worried that all this investment, all this levelling up, going to former Labour heartlands, and that they're going to be forgotten in parts of the South East?
Yes, and I can understand why the riposte of some of the Northern Conservatives might be, well, hang on a second, our areas do actually need a little bit more funding than yours has enjoyed for many years. But there is quite a bit of bitterness, not just at local council level, but actually amongst Conservative MPs in the southeast of England as well, who look at the levelling up agenda and think, well, you know, it focuses on the north, that there's some work going on in the southwest, in Cornwall and so on, but the southeast is being forgotten, not just in terms of levelling up, but in terms of the impact of other policies. So the planning reforms, for instance, that the Conservatives are pursuing are always very unpopular in the southeast of England, which is where the demand for new housing is at its highest. So we are likely to see more political rows going on about the balance of focus and about the extent of the Conservative Party's sympathy for voters in the southeast.
Right. I mean, Sienna, should Labour be building, though, on those gains, even if they're small, in parts of the southeast?
Yes, I think so. I mean, there's this interesting discussion at the moment within the Labour Party about the so-called blue wall, which is obviously much less discussed than the red wall that kind of journalists like to talk about a lot. But we saw in these elections, there were, I mean, hugely disappointing results in places like Hartlepool and the Tees Valley mayoralty, which, you know, as people have pointed out, was basically a lot of it based on pork barrel politics, which was, you know, elect us and we're going to invest in your area. Why would people not be convinced by that?
Right.
But we had Cambridgeshire and Peterborough, a win from the Tories for Labour. That's something to be celebrated.
All right, we've only got 20 seconds. Andrew, pork barrel politics, that's what it's all about.
Say that's rich coming from the party of Gordon Brown, Alistair Darling, but we're out of time, so I can't go any further on that. All I'm saying, all I will say is opportunity is widespread across this country, but talent is, and that's why we're determined to level up no matter where in the United Kingdom you live.
Thank you to all of my guests today. That's all we've got time for today, but I will be back, of course, tomorrow at 12:15. Please join me then. Bye-bye.